Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mic on there. Good evening. First off, if I may, thank you so much for the incredibly warm welcome that I've received since my arrival here in Miami. This is an amazing city, I have to say. This is my first visit here, and allow me to please again extend my thanks to the Dela Cruz family, as well as to Yvette and her team, who have been so great. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it, actually. This evening, I have for you a few brief notes on points of connection between art and history. In London, the city I know a bit more about than Miami, I feel like I should give you a few words, though, as we begin tonight, on the impetus for tonight's talk. This entire conversation we'll have this evening is based on a conversation that Yvette and I had in London a few months back. We were chatting about coming to Miami, and I mentioned that I had never been to Miami before, and asked Yvette if she would please sell it to me in a minute and tell me what's so great about Miami in art, you know. And she said a lot of very complimentary things, but one that really stuck with me, she said that what New York did with art in 100 years, Miami has done in 30. I remember thinking that is high praise, and as far as I can tell, the case as well. But this got us talking over dinner one night in London about what makes a city an art city, you know, or an art capital. There's much discussion about which, you know, out of the sort of handful of cities in the world that matter, you know, which ones are really the best for art, if you'd like. And London is an unusual example, I have to say, is that I gather from my students as well as visitors that I meet at the Tate and around, that London is regarded as a cool city. I couldn't possibly speak on the nature of cool myself. That's not in my wheelhouse, but I gather from cool people, London is regarded as cool. And when we talk about that, London as a cool city in art terms, something that comes up quite often is, of course, my home gallery, Tate Modern, where I've worked for about 15 years myself. And I think it's a really unusual move, actually, talking about Tate Modern, because particularly for younger people, there is just an assumption that when you visit London, a necessary stop on that visit is, of course, popping by Tate Modern to see what's on display, to, you know, the all-important Instagram selfies in the Turbine Hall, you know, the usual stuff. It's always good, it's nice. But what younger people particularly tend to forget is that Tate Modern, despite being the world's most visited modern art museum, gets just north of about 5 million visitors per year. That's about 1.5 million more than MoMA. It's immensely popular. It's very new. It only opened in 2000. I mean, this is Tate Modern today with the recently opened Blavatnik building extension you can see coming off the back there on the south side. This is Tate Modern in 2019. This is the building in the 1980s. This is not that long ago. This photograph's taken around 1985, thereabouts. That's not that long ago. This is recent stuff, you know, and indeed, for much of the history, certainly of the 20th century, London, in modern art terms, is kind of an artistic backwater. I mean, obviously there are a few notable exceptions, we'll mention them tonight, but broadly speaking, London isn't really the city you go to make great art in the 20th century. That's Paris or New York, really. Whereas for much of the previous century, when we think of London in art terms, we tend to think more of old masters in places like, say, the National Gallery, itself a Regency invention, founded in 1824, a collection that, as you know, I don't want to say competes with, but certainly works alongside with the other major European institutions, the Louvre, the Prado, the Hermitage, you know, the heavy hitters of European art history. And the National, as I'm sure you know, is not nearly as large as the Louvre or the Prado, but what it lacks in size, it more than makes up for in sheer masterpieces per square foot. You know, it's a crazy stacked collection. And I think it's an interesting one when thinking about the history of the National. In a sense, more so than the Tate, I think we can see maybe a bit more about how London has functioned historically as an art city through the legacy of the National Gallery. The collection is founded in part on the remnants of the collection of this man here, John Julius Angerstein. He was a financier and business guy of some renown in London, of Russian extraction, if you're curious, who built a spectacular collection of old masters, particularly by, I don't want to bore you, this is really tedious stuff, but principally in buying the collection from the deposed Duc d'Orléans at the end of the 18th century. It's very famous, one of the most famous sales in art history, where he brought, Angerstein, brought paintings like Raphael's masterpiece, the Portrait of Pope Julius II, one of the absolute anchor paintings of the collection, which is saying something. To be an anchor painting of the National Collection is pretty good. This is inarguably one of the most famous portraits in London, which makes it one of the most famous in the world. But also purchasing 17th and 18th century masterpieces. He's a great collector of Claude, for example. So one of the famous works, one of the famous Claudes of the Nationalist Collection here, the seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, a painting that was instrumental in the subsequent development of the British artist that I'll be talking about tomorrow, J.M.W. Turner. One of Turner's many masterpieces in the Nationalist Collection, of course, here, Dido Building Carthage, is a painting that is directly inspired by the earlier Claude. And indeed, Turner, in a codicil to his will, insisted that the Dido Building Carthage painting be put on display in the National Gallery alongside another of his works called Fisherman at Sea, in a room with two paintings by Claude, one of which being the seaport with the embarkation of Sheba, and that there should be nothing else that hangs in that room. So when you're next in London, you find yourself wandering past the Rubens, you will find yourself in a small octagonal gallery that no art historian thinks makes any sense, as there are two 17th century French works next to two 19th century British works. Think, what the hell is this? Well, no, it's Turner's will, actually, which the National, to their eternal credit, have maintained ever since, creating a sort of through line, if you'd like, from the old masters of the 17th and 18th, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that Turner so admired and emulated to his own 19th century genius. This is all stock standard stuff, and I don't know if it's particularly interesting, but an aspect of Angerstein's life that is quite interesting is in addition to being a financier and heavy in insurance and the like of it, he also, through his marriage, became one of the richest slave traders in Britain at the end of the 18th century. And the Angerstein collection is built, I don't want to say exclusively, but pretty heavily on the slave trade. You know, this is a serious issue that some of our colleagues at Tate will say, well, you see, we don't have to worry about this. Sir Henry Tate, of course, built his fortune in the 19th century, long after the slave trade was abolished. So his hands are clean. You think, well, yes, that's true, broadly. He certainly built his fortune in the sugar trade after the end of the slave trade in the empire, that's true. But I should point out that a British sugar magnate running sugar plantations in Jamaica in the 19th century, they're not using slaves, they're not using not slaves. And I'm not trying to make light of the legacy of slavery here, but my point is that they're not legally slaves. It's complicated, if you see. And my point is this. When we think about London's relationship with art, which long before London was ever a city in which great art was consistently made, it was from the 18th century. I mean, and really we can see in some aspects in the 17th century, a city in which great art was bought and sold. And here we can see, I think, the origin in some degree, you know, or even actually just spitballing here, you can take the idea even a step further, as we often say that the godfather of British art is Hans Holbein, an irony, given that Hans Holbein is about as British as I am. He's German, you know, in point of fact. But that even he is brought to London, not so much by any great desire to live in the capital city, but more because he gets word that there is a lot of money in London and there are no artists that are any good, frankly. That's what brings him to simply put, you know, it brings him to London. So there is this connection between money and culture, and whether you think of Hans Holbein cleaning up the reign of Henry VIII through portraiture, or Angerstein cleaning up slave money through buying clothes, you know, and giving them to the nation. This is an interesting point of connection that needs to be made. It's something that could be largely sidestepped, I think, or to a degree sidestepped, by the collection and curation and buying and selling of contemporary art. Obviously, that's, we're not worrying so much about the slave trade, but this is an interesting one for me, and just something worth considering when we're thinking about what makes an art city, is the sort of money that drives that, I suppose. It's all well and good to talk about the sort of business end of things, but I wish to consider as well the culture that produces art. I think if London has value as a global city, I think its value lies specifically, and ironically, if you'd like, in the legacy of the empire. As you know, London is arguably the most polyglot city on the face of the earth. Every major language that's spoken in the world is spoken within the M25 in Greater London. The world is there. This is, of course, in no small part due to the legacy of the British Empire. It brings me to one of my favorite, no, I don't know why I'm doing that, my favorite contemporary British painter whose work is so intimately bound up with thinking about identity, Britishness, Londonness, what it means to exist in that country. And of course, issues of ethnicity and identity. I'm talking, of course, about the masterful Chris O'Philly, who you're looking at here with his 1997 masterpiece, a personal favorite of mine, Pimpin' Ain't Easy, a work we will return to in a moment. This is not a work we have in the Tate collection, annoyingly. I wish we did. Instead, if you wish to see a great O'Philly at Tate Britain, you'll have to settle for his 1998 masterpiece, No Woman, No Cry, a work about which I could bore you for hours, but shan't tonight. Suffice to say, O'Philly, for those of you who are less familiar with his biography, born in Manchester in the north of England in the 1960s to Nigerian parents who came to the UK following the dissolution of the African wing of the British Empire. As memory serves, his father worked in the McVitie's cookie factory. They're just ex-imperial immigrants coming to England to make their way. Their boy, Chris, is studying at the Royal College of Art, scholarships from the British Council, winner of the Turner Prize in 1998 for No Woman, No Cry. But to return to a painting like Pimpin' Ain't Easy, one of the things that fascinates me about this work is just how much emphasis O'Philly is giving, first towards issues of stereotype. I mean, obviously, part of the joke here is that you are seeing an enormous penis and testicles with hyper-Africanoid features on it. I mean, this is a joke on some level, quite clearly. But if you look more closely at what is decorating the painting, you'll notice that there is an aspect of collage in the work, specifically photographs taken from magazines. This is a painting from 1997, so the references are from the later 90s, where you can see black athletes. There's Scottie Pippen, very prominent, just above the testicles there. Evander Holyfield, James Brown on the lower left. These famous African-American athletes and entertainers whose heads have been placed on top of the bodies of black pornographic actresses who populate some of the porno mags that used to be sold in the shops around O'Philly's studio in King's Cross in North London. Again, a reference to hypersexualization, which is interesting enough. The title of the painting, Pimpin' Ain't Easy, is a reference to a number of different hip-hop songs, actually, if you're not up on the history of hip-hop. Big Daddy Kane, famously in 1989, had a song called Pimpin' Ain't Easy, as well as Ice-T on his 1986 album, I want to say, Power. Pimpin' Ain't Easy, but somebody gotta do it. Great track, if you're curious. Anyway, my point here is that the reference points that O'Philly is playing with, either American professional athletes or the New York hip-hop of Big Daddy Kane or the LA hip-hop of Ice-T, is that those are all American references. Those aren't British references, and unless you are a sort of Marcus Garveyite, Pan-Africanist, diasporic scholar, one can make an argument that the identity of black British people is on some fundamental level distinct from African American identity, not just for reasons of geography, but also of history. Ophelia is looking at this culture as an outsider, in much the same way as a boy from Manchester with a northern accent, coming down to London would be a strange thing in the 1980s, as indeed, as a student at the Royal College of Art in the 1980s, he would be one of the only black faces that he would see there. I mean, most black people would be carrying trays at those gallery openings then. So Ophelia occupies this very curious space between indubitably identifying as British by dint of being born in Britain, by having a British accent and a British passport. He never lived anywhere else. He doesn't live there now, infuriatingly, but he left some years ago, but he is British in point of fact. But at the same time, occupying a space that is not British in the way that a lot of my British contemporaries in London are British or perceived as such. And there is something about that in-between nature that I think makes London a city that is available to the making of great art like this. I'm hard-pressed to think of many artists off the top of my head who so incisively and humorously deal with these kinds of issues as Ophelia does, and his work is, as I say, represented in the Tate, in major private collections around the world, and indeed at the National Portrait Gallery. So you're looking here at an early Ophelia self-portrait from 1991 that's in the permanent collection at the National Portrait Gallery, the NPG, in London, another gallery for whom I work regularly. This is a work that was featured as a finalist in one of the BP Portrait Prize, the annual competition the gallery does for contemporary portraiture, and now hangs on the mezzanine level at the NPG. The NPG, again, another 19th century invention, rather like the National we were just talking about. The NPG founded in 1856, a Victorian, slightly later. This is the same Victorian institution. It shows Ophelia, that also shows this, one of the most contentious works in the collection. This is Thomas Jones Barker's notorious Secret of England's Greatness from around 1863. No one's exactly sure quite when it was painted, but probably 63-ish. Indubitably a painting that 2019 will find problematic, yes, for myriad reasons. Again, I don't want to bore you too much with this evening, but if you're curious, this painting is remarkably racially insensitive, but it is doing so in a very particular way. Again, I don't want to bore you with this. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of what's happening here. Those two figures on the right side there, particularly the guy on the far right is Viscount Palmerston, the former Foreign Secretary, then current Prime Minister, chief architect of gunboat diplomacy in the loose British Empire. The painting is speaking to a mid-Victorian belief in not only the white man's burden, but also the potential for the perfectibility of non-white people through their association with British culture. The idea Palmerston governs under is that black people or Aboriginal indigenous populations in South, in Oceania, whatever, that these people are not fundamentally different to white folks, but instead they simply have not attained the appropriate level of culturation, and that it is the job of the British Empire to provide that culturation. It also will be immensely profitable. It's known colloquially as gunboat diplomacy, as Palmerston is the architect, largely, of that idea. So the painting is super duper racist, there's no question about that, but I'm specifically interested in the way it is very particularly super duper racist in 1863, which is different to the way we would use, say, biological determinist racism today. It's a different gig. But in any event, the National Portrait Gallery is a place that can hang this and can hang Ophelia, and can do so unironically and ambiguously. I say this not to level the old school criticism against the National Portrait Gallery, and this is one that does the rounds every few years, that the NPG is as one wag put it, pale, male, and stale. It's a sort of a home of crusty old white dudes. I don't know if I quite agree with that, but the idea that the gallery can maintain this scope of work, I think, as opposed to being simply a reminder of the bad old days of empire, instead speaks to the ability of London to absorb that history while at the same time morphing and changing into something that's far more accommodating. This manifests itself in a variety of ways. In the 20th century, I'd like to move back into modernity. Now, thinking about some of the events that define London's history as a modern city, of course, the decline of the city, the end days of empire, a tremendous, no more single event, of course, than the Blitz in London, the Second World War, speaking to the city's decline. Indeed, to return to Tate Modern for a moment, people often forget that Bankside Power Station, as it was known before it was turned into Tate Modern in the late 90s, was actually built specifically as a triumphalist kind of modern marvel to power and brutalist architecture. It's quoting from and answering back to St. Paul's Cathedral across the river. Giles Gilbert Scott, the architect, specifically designing it as a cathedral of power, as he says, and we often think of the closure of that power station in the early 1980s by Margaret Thatcher as being kind of last dying gasp of the empire in some way, or the last dying gasp of London as the world's capital city in some sense. It's interesting that it gets resuscitated only a few years later as an art space, which people often forget. The late 90s, there was considerable debate at Tate about whether anyone would show up at Tate Modern. This seems remarkable today that this would be the case. There's a genuine concern in the late 1990s that Londoners simply didn't give a damn about modern art. When you think about that today, when your visit to London is not complete without, lunch and a show at Tate Modern, it speaks to how transformative London as an art city has become, As we think about someone, say, like Francis Bacon, whose art, particularly something like the Studies for Figures at the Base of the Crucifixion, one of the, again, anchor paintings at Tate Britain, is often read in terms of suffering, of cry, of the Holocaust, of the Blitz, of the existential suffering of the world in the 20th century. And I think these are broadly interpretations that Bacon's paintings are available for. But there is something else as well. Bacon defined his own art as being a kind of nexus between his atheism, famously saying, "We are only meat," M-E-A-T, as in, where this is it, but also his sexuality, which we must remember at all times that until I think about 1967, don't quote me on that, I want to say it's 67, 68, the passage of the Sexual Offences Act in the United Kingdom, which effectively made gay male sex legal, or at least semi-legal. Before that, there is no legal scope for two men to have sex with one another, and they can absolutely go to prison for that, and often do. And Bacon's identity as an artist, certainly for the first half of his life and about the first, third or so of his artistic career, first half, I guess, really, is predicated on having to use a kind of coded language, sorts of symbols and signs that speak to one community, specifically a gay community in London in one way, that speak differently to other straight or sort of square communities. When people come to Tate Britain for a tour, they often ask to see this particular work, and we dutifully take them there. It is a very famous set of paintings. But I'm actually more interested in another Bacon triptych in the Tate's collection. This is the August 72, dedicated to his lover, George Dyer. You can see Dyer there on the left panel, who'd sadly committed suicide the year before this painting was produced. It is the central panel of the triptych that I find most interesting. What appears at first to be a sort of amorphous, surrealist abstraction, if you look more closely, and you'll please accept my apologies, I've neglected to bring the photograph with me this evening, is actually based on a photograph taken by Edward Muybridge, who he's the famous stop-motion photographer who tried to prove whether or not all of a horse's hooves leave the ground when it's galloping. These old photographs of two men wrestling. In fact, if you look closely, you can just about work out on the central panel on the lower left a man's face being shoved down. You can see hair a bit there. If you look at the very top panel, you can see a thigh, a hip, a rear end. What you're looking at are two men in the process of wrestling. Of course, at risk of vulgarity here in the august halls of the De La Cruz Collection. Two men wrestling is a very obvious euphemism. That's he's talking about gay sex there. That's what that is, and that's fine. And that's a reference that seems to be reasonably clear to us in 2019. But there was this other aspect of two men squaring off against each other, of struggle, of a kind of a fight, if you like, that is really about as good a way of describing Bacon's relationship with George Dyer, which of course, as I ends in Dyer's suicide in 1971. This is a set of paintings that speaks one way to one audience, but is saying something else, and saying something, I think, rather more in line with what Bacon intends the paintings to mean, to an audience that is au fait with what it is he's talking about. Slang, if you'd like. And this, again, is something I find really interesting, because Bacon, during his own lifetime, repeatedly said that his paintings were destined for the National Gallery or the dustbin, meaning that every single work of art he produced, he intended to, well, again, it's an American audience, so I can say this, you'll understand what I mean, to swing for the fences with every work he makes. He doesn't make second-tier art. He's intending masterpiece every time, which is remarkable, whether attained or not is a matter of debate, but it's certainly what he's gunning for, so we can't think of these as sort of throwaway remarks. If we continue along this vein, particularly mining the world of record-breaking auction prices for artworks, you'll remember, of course, briefly, Bacon held the sobriquet of the highest price paid at auction for a work of art with the Freud triptych a few years ago, since, of course, repeatedly trumped. Another one recently emerging, of course, David Hockney, great favorite of the art-going public these days, has recently broken the record for highest price paid for a living artist. You're looking here at, again, his Tate masterpiece, A Bigger Splash, one of the anchor works in the Tate's collection, and a painting that has been so endlessly discussed to have been copied, imitated, parodied to a degree that I feel somewhat disinclined to talk about it tonight. It's a painting with which you are familiar. That I'd instead like for us to consider another aspect of Hockney's body of work, and something that in 2019 we don't bother with so much, not because it's seen as unseemly or anything, but because I think we're finally in a position in the Western world where this doesn't have to be remarkable, but something that really pervades Hockney's work in the 1960s, particularly in the immediate context of his graduation from the Royal College of Art, again, the same school that Ophelia went to, is the queerness of his paintings. As I say, we don't bother describing David Hockney as a gay artist in the 21st century, because you don't have to. He's a great artist. We don't need that modifier, But certainly in the 1960s, he's regarding himself as a gay artist. That is indubitably the case, and indeed making use of a similar, not the same, but similar sort of visual codes to the ones that Bacon is using. In fact, here's a good little bit of art history for you. When Hockney was a student at the Royal College of Art in the early, first years, 1960, 1961, Tate, then just the Tate Gallery, held a mid-career retrospective, very famous exhibition, mid-career retrospective of Francis Bacon's work, which Hockney attended several times. And it is clear that this exhibition has great influence on, and Bacon's work more generally has great influence on Hockney's work in the early 60s. You don't see it so much here with A Bigger Splash, but if you turn to a slightly earlier Hockney, here in 1961's Doll Boy, we see something, this is clearly influenced by Bacon. You don't even have to know art history to know that. That's easy. But what's of more interest to me are, again, the hidden codes that are being used in this painting that anybody who is vaguely, kind of with it or cool in London in the early 1960s would immediately get, but no square is ever going to understand this. in 1961. The title of the painting, Doll Boy, here, a seeming reference to this amorphous, vaguely masculine figure wearing a baby doll dress. This dress appears regularly in Hockney's work in the early 1960s, set against a Bacon-style amorphous, again, background, the words Doll Boy, written on the left, the word Queen, a seemingly very obvious reference to most of us today, in the lower center. But if you look on the lower left, just next to the figure's legs, you'll see a number, 3.18, 318, this is what usually trips people up, is Hockney uses this code in the early 1960s, particularly in the context of his graduation pieces at the RCA and his first work before moving to Los Angeles, to reference specific individuals. It's a very simple code, by the way. It's simply substituting numbers for letters. So you'll find in his early work he uses 26 different numbers in his paintings. Each of these correspond to a letter. So in this case, we're looking at someone whose initials are C and R. Specifically, that would be, and again, this is not as obvious, I think, to an American audience, because this is somebody who's a really British guy. This is a reference to the pop singer Cliff Richard, who doesn't make overly much of a splash in the United States. I mean, he's come to be regarded as the British Elvis. But in British terms, he's a really big deal. Just trust me, he's terribly, terribly important. Hockney has subsequently talked about this, that he had a terrible crush on Cliff Richard, as many young men and women did. In the early 90s, he's a devastatingly good-looking dude. He made cool movies like this Espresso Bongo, his great albums. He's very good. And indeed, one of Richard's hits in the early 1960s was a song called Living Doll, which Hockney and his gay cohort in London kind of translate into a term that they use for young men that they find particularly attractive, a doll boy. So in this case, we see this alphanumeric coding, a direct reference to Cliff Richard, as well as what we can imagine to perhaps be a self-portrait of David Hockney jitterbugging to the Cliff Richard song Living Doll, which he is referring to here as Doll Boy, in this remarkably queer painting. This is really outre if you know how to read it. There's no reference made in Hockney's early critical successes in the 1960s towards the sexuality of his work, because it's entirely possible, although I would argue somewhat limited, to read his works beyond reference to his sexuality. This is the kind of fine line, if you like, that we see someone like Hockney walking, or the parodic elements of other great British artists like Richard Hamilton. Again, you'll forgive me, when I was made aware of how many of you would be joining us this evening, I felt it was my duty as an historian of British art to show you some Hamilton. For those of you who are not familiar with Hamilton's work, Richard Hamilton is one of the most significant artists of the 20th century, the inventor of pop art, one of the inventors of installation art. He is a tremendously significant figure whose market position does not reflect his historical significance. So it is worthwhile I have all of you with me this evening. I insist that you pay attention to this, because it's a big deal. You're looking here at one of Hamilton's first great works, 1956 advertisement for an exhibition called This Is Tomorrow, an exhibition, a group show with which he participated and debatably produced, if not the first, amongst the first works of installation art, as well as of pop art many years before Andy starts working with Brillo pad boxes. Here with this work, just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing? So making reference and use of kind of tedious suburban sexuality. There's a woman with a lampshade on her head, the ultimate symbol of, a corny suburban party getting out of hand. It says we're one short step from throwing our keys in a bowl here. The lampshade on the head. Taking a rather critical view, or a view that has criticism within it, of American popular culture, that Hamilton, because he refuses to participate in American, or New York specifically, museological culture in the 1960s. Again, I shan't bore you too much with this story. He has a number of personal tragedies in the early 60s, his wife passing away specifically, that really precludes him from participating in this explosion of money and art in New York in the early 60s that he would be in a prime position to make use of for a variety of personal reasons, and he just doesn't want to. He doesn't. He ends up in American histories of pop art rather sidelined, which is a great frustration, and is, I think, perhaps best known to an American audience, not for anything like this, but instead for designing the cover of the White Album, which again, if arguably inventing pop art and being singular in the creation of installation art isn't enough for you, he also popularizes minimalism with the Beatles album cover. He's very good. Do spend some time with him, you know. And British pop terms, of course, you consider someone like Peter Blake, another figure instrumental in the development of pop art in the 50s and 1960s. Unlike Hamilton, actually still with us rather happily. Those of you who collect, I'll give you some inside info from London on this. While Blake is a man of advanced years, he is well into his 80s, I can tell you that he is engaging in a period of incredible productivity at the moment. And again, I should just say this, I don't get a cut of this, so this is not an advertisement, this is just a piece of genuine advice for you, if you want to buy for cheap the work of a living master. So I had a conversation with his dealer recently, and I said, "What? I see Blake's putting out a lot of stuff. What's happening with that?" He said, "Well, you know, Peter knows he's going to die soon. He's an old man, and he wants to leave a lot of work behind, simply put. So he's generating a lot of product. I would highly recommend checking some out sometime. They're not particularly easy to get in the United States. You go to London, I can get you one today if you want. It's easy enough. I don't even need a cut. You know, just happy for you to have a Blake. He's really good. Again, most famous, of course, with his wife designing the Sgt. Pepper's cover. A reminder that Beatles albums covers were really awesome. They're really good. In fine art terms, I think of it more for something like the Fine Art Bit, 1959, a work satirizing or making parodic the emergent, hard-edged abstraction of the later New York school, taking a sort of Duchampian line on the notion of originality. You're looking here at a set of postcards glued to the top of a wooden board on which a number of horizontal bands of color have been added. It's such a funny painting. Those of you who are of a sufficient vintage, as I am, to remember going to a museum prior to the era of smartphones, and when you see a work of art that you like, going to the shop and buying the postcard, you know, and bringing it home. This is what he's done here with these works of art, begging us to answer the question of what part of the painting constitutes the fine art bit, or if you'd like in American English, the fine art part. What part of this is fine art, if you'd like. Quite a remarkable thing for 1959. He's cool like that, and very much still around. While we're on the subject of cool, to return, I want to consider the artist who, more than any other, is responsible for good or ill the reputation of London as a global art capital these days, and we're referring, of course, to the world's richest living artist, and I would say probably the world's most contentious living artist, Mr. Damien Hirst, an artist whom we have all developed on some level a love-hate relationship. If you follow Hirst's work with any depth, you will know, but certainly my position is, that Damien Hirst is right. He makes works of heartbreaking brilliance that speak deeply and meaningfully to what it means to be alive. He's probably been right about 5 times. A lot of the rest of it's sort of dictator chic, you know? I don't know. The wallpaper for rich people. I don't mean to offend you if you're a rich person who has Damien Hirst. You have excellent taste in wallpaper. He does sell wallpaper if you're curious, actually. Quite literally, it's 600 pounds a roll if you want some. He sells it through other criteria. I don't mean to cause offense, but it's just one man's opinion. But Hirst, through exhibitions like Frieze and Gambler, his relationship with the Saatchi Gallery, his own remarkable interventions into the level between art and commerce, obviously drawing from the examples of Jeff Koons and above all Andy Warhol, as well as cribbing some ideas about life and death from Bacon. Hirst has done more, I think, than anyone else to establish the brand London as an art city works like the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, or the shark, as it's colloquially known. I invite you, please, if you take any of my advice this evening, to do this, if you would be so kind. The next time this comes up in conversation, please don't refer to this work as the shark. It makes me crazy when people do that, because a lot of the criticism that is leveled against this work, particularly by like a less engaged kind of non-art audience, obviously by dint of the fact you're here means you care, but you're having a conversation with, I don't know, somebody you went to college with or something, who doesn't pay attention to this sort of thing. And they say, oh yeah, I saw that Shark by Damien Hirst. It sucks. And so like, well, 9/10 of the people that say that, first off, call it the Shark, which is wrong. And secondly, I've never looked at it in person. Instead, look at it like this is the view that's usually given when it's shown in newspapers and stuff. And you definitely get a sense of what the thing is. It's a, formaldehyde preserved shark in a steel and glass vitrine tripartite structure. Looks kind of broken up like a work of minimalism or something. It's kind of like a Donald Judd or something. That's all fine. But when you call it the shark and you look at a picture of it from that angle, it does rather more look like something that would belong in the Natural History Museum than art, which I get. If you instead call it, as it is titled, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, I realize it's a mouthful, but if you can memorize your phone number, you can memorize that. It's like 8 words or something, whatever, you'll be fine. And instead of looking at it from the side, instead saying, I am looking at the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, which is this, that makes a lot more sense. Yes? And why I flag this up is again, I don't want to bore you with the meaning behind this. Who cares about meaning? But this work, more than any other, is used as a signal example of what used to be known as YBA art, or the Young British Artists art. This is the same generation that Chris O'Feely belongs to, Tracy Emin. And indeed, it speaks volumes to just how unhelpful that term YBA is. These people have nothing in common with their art. They drink in the same bars. I wouldn't consider myself having in common with a lot of the people who drink in the same bars I drink in. If you can find some kind of connection, a meaningful artistic connection between Chris O'Feely, Damien Hirst, and Tracy Emin, I'll buy you dinner. Good luck. You won't find it. They just happen to be in London at the same time and same place. And rather the same way, Freud and Bacon are often connected. The School of London, as R.B. Kitai famously posed. Again, they're not talking about the same stuff. And they have nothing in common. They just drink together and they're friends for a while. In any event, why flag this up? Because I'm reminded of the difference. I said, the topic of tonight's discussion, Notes from London on art history. I was eager to think about some of the distinctions between art and art history. And it's weird that I could think of the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living as an historic work of art. In a manner of speaking, in London it is. It's in a sense that we would regard that as kind of old in some ways. And certainly contemporary collectors would. I think it's imperative to remember that one of the differences between art history and art vis-a-vis a particular place, a given city, a location, I think that art history really functions as a study or a kind of investigation into where a given city or a given place was at a particular period and from a particular vantage point. Obviously, we don't do universalism in the 21st century, but one can hopefully, as an art historian, draw certain conclusions about what, say, Paris in 1889 was like for a certain segment of the population, by looking at Gauguin or Vincent or whoever, or that we assume we can learn something about Florence in the Quattrocento by looking at 15th century Renaissance painters. It's kind of the basis of cultural art history. Whereas art, like art that's now art, I don't think it really works like that. You understand what I mean when I say that? Have you ever had this experience? I have it all the time. I go to like a degree show for a college or something, or go to a group show in some kind of up-and-coming place where friends are, oh, this is the place to go, this is new stuff. And you go look at it and think, I have no idea if this is good or not. I can know that I think it's cool, I guess, again, to return to that thorny term, or that I like it. But that doesn't make it good. I mean, how much stuff do you like that is terrible? We all have guilty pleasures. And I'm not saying to make a joke, that's fine. Who would give you the authority to be dismissive of someone who likes paintings of dogs playing poker? What kind of a monster are you? No, I'm deadly serious when I say this. What gives you the right to judge someone for liking that? People are entitled to like whatever they like. I mean, as it happens, it's the consensus that those paintings aren't very good, but we all have guilty pleasures. So it's hard to know, It's in a sense I've often wondered that, whether the difference between art history and art is, art that's being made at a given time and place is like what maybe like a particular city deserves or something, or what a particular city wants, I guess, in some way. And I think about this as an interesting one because in 1991, when Damien Hirst produces this work, while he is certainly beginning an association with Charles Saatchi and beginning a meteoric rise to fame, he's not quite there yet. I would describe him broadly as still a pretty street-level guy in 1991, certainly in 1990 anyway. That by 2007, say, Hirst is well en route to having a career retrospective at Tate Modern to coincide with the London Olympics. He will be notorious for bypassing the entire network of dealers and gallerists by selling an entire body of work directly to the public through Sotheby's in an exhibition he entitles Beautiful Inside My Head Forever, in which he nets over 100 million pounds in 2 days of trading. That is phenomenal in terms of profit. You come to something like this and say, well, okay, is this good? Maybe. Hey, it's cool. I don't know if you've ever been in the room with this. It's a hell of a thing to see, man. In the same way that like going into a Bulgari dealership is a hell of a thing to see. It's, yeah. When I go look in Cartier, I don't know if I think it's art. I think it's like fancy stuff, that's for sure. It's expensive, that's great, but I don't know, This is what I mean when I say these points I'm wishing you to just consider in the context of your city, of Miami, is when does a work of art become historical? What is now? What is the art that we're producing? What is the art that we're consuming? What is the art that we're talking about saying? Or what might it say in the future about us now? What is the legacy that's being left behind? What history is being written? Because we are narrow-minded and short-sighted in the extreme if we believe, those of us particularly in this room tonight who are collectors, who are dropping 6 and 7 figures on works of art with a view perhaps of donating them to a museum or creating your own collection at some point in the future, as the brave amongst us have. To think that doesn't have tremendous implications, not just for how art works in Miami, but for how you will be judged later. And you will. That matters a lot, man. Yeah, but we're talking about this in a kind of top-down context. I want to leave you this evening with a final set of examples of art we have in London that I think is a point worth making if we're thinking about an art city, about a given city's relationship to the art that is produced and consumed in that place. And again, I think it goes without saying that in order for a city to be an art capital, truly, it can't just be a place where people with a lot of money spend a lot of money buying art that's flown in from wherever. That's what London had in the 18th century. The first half of the 18th century, art-wise in London, is terrible. If you don't agree with me on that, I invite you to name your favorite British artist of the first half of the 18th century, and you can't say William Hogarth. I'll wait. It's a city where a lot of money gets made and a lot of money gets spent on art, yes. But, I don't know that we would call it an art capital in that regard. My point is that the art that is produced in a place is instrumental in the way in which the city can understand itself artistically, but also the way in which future historians can consider it. I leave you tonight with two examples from Florence by Sandro Botticelli of Primavera, Birth of Venus fame. There are a handful of great Botticellis in London, in the National Gallery, again, one of my favorites here. Venus and Mars, a painting produced almost certainly, although we're not exactly sure who it was made for, as a wedding gift, probably to fit inside of a large trunk, sort of hope chest safety deposit box known as a cassone in Renaissance Italy. This is conjecture, but I think it's probably the case. A painting that is indicative of Botticelli's, the subject matter for which he's most famous. Mythological scenery, allegorical imagery, particularly is derived from Ovid's Metamorphoses, kind of stock text. This is also the work with which he is most closely associated with his great patrons, the Medici family. Not so much directly Lorenzo the Magnificent, but more Lorenzo's extended family, who seemed to make up the principal market for Botticelli's work in the 1480s. This is the same man who produces this work in 1485, who produces this in 1500. And again, you don't need a degree in art history to see just how different this is. There is something which, for lack of a better term, strikes us as being rather medieval about the mystic nativity that is wholly absent from Venus and Mars. And the way that we popularly think about art history is that of an inexorable progress or flow towards us. Yes, the moving away from darkness into the light. This is the old Giorgio Vasari thing. This is the Whiggish 19th century history of modern art thing. This is the idea, this is Clement Greenberg's thing. This is how we write history. Of course, we know it's not really like that. It's trite, but it's very popular. And so to look at this, you think, well, hold on, if he's making like wild-ass, totally non-Christian allegorical paintings in 1485, what brings him back to something that is really medievalist, in the year 1500? And the answer lies in this. It's a story, if you've never heard it before, you'll be interested. We see in the 1490s the waning 2 years of the rule of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He dies in 1492. And I don't want to bore you with dates, but just real quick. Dies in 1492. 2 years after his death, the Medici were expelled from Florence, led in part by a charismatic preacher named Girolamo Savonarola, who preached that the world would end in the year 1500, and Florence was singled out for destruction, principally because of the ungodly nature of the art, the costumes, the jewelry, the makeup, the finery, the wanton gay sex. Indeed, male-on-male sex is so common in 15th century Florence that the German word for a buggerer, for a man who has sex with another man, is Florenzer. That's what it's known for internationally, then at least. That Savonarola's position is because of this, the world will end and we will be punished. It is for this reason, amongst a lot of others, there's an invasion of Florence by the King of France. There's a bunch, I don't want to bore you, but suffice to say, this plays a part. The Medici are run out of town for the next 4 years. Florence becomes a theocratic dictatorship known as the Republic of God before, spoiler alert, Savonarola himself is burned at the stake in 1498. He never lives to 1500. He never finds out how wrong he was. One of Savonarola's devotees was Sandro Botticelli, who believed passionately that the world would end in the year 1500. I invite you to look at the date on this painting. You will notice I'm not giving you a circa. I'm not hedging my bets. I can tell you definitively this painting was made in the year 1500. Botticelli is very clear about that. The text at the top, written in Greek, explains it. I shan't bore you with it. The upshot is it says that the world's going to end this year. According to legend, probably not true, but it's still, the fact that the story is told tells us it has value. When Girolamo Savonarola in 1497 arranged the famous bonfire of the vanities, in which he forcibly removed luxury objects or things he perceived as being ungodly and burned them in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, the legend is Botticelli brought his own paintings, ones like this, to be burned. And you think, well, what the hell? When we think about the high watermark of Renaissance Florentine culture in the 15th century, you think of Botticelli. That's your guy, that there's this hot minute where people are making paintings about gods and goddesses and we throw off all these medieval shackles and we're all groovy for a minute, and this is a fine story, and that's true for like 50 people in Florence. Absolutely, that's true for like a handful of folks. But the overwhelming majority of Florentines in the 15th century are straight up illiterate medieval Catholics who have never read Ovid's Metamorphoses. I'll tell you someone else who has never read Ovid's Metamorphoses. Botticelli. He doesn't read Latin. The only Renaissance painter that does, other than Leonardo, of course, is Mantegna. That's not a thing. My point is this. The overwhelming citizenry of the Florentine Republic in the 1490s, the so-called Popolo Minuto, had no stake in this kind of art. Literally none. This is art that is made by people in the employ of rich people, for the enjoyment of rich people, and the understanding exclusively of rich people. That's what's up. When we see Botticelli make art that is to be understood by Popolo Minuto, a term that requires no translation, you get this. What goes wrong in Florence in the 1490s, in addition to a lot of other wild stuff, is it's not a city that is ultimately invested in art. It is a city with a handful of real rich folks that are invested in art and hope it'll trickle down, and that's not how things work. More is required, and I'm sure I don't need to spell out the great debt, if I may say, concludingly, that the great debt that a generation of young scholars here in Florida have to our hosts this evening for actually making it better than it was in Florence in the 1490s, which is no bad thing, and long may it continue. Ultimately, I don't know how Miami is an art city or what would make it a greater art city. Is it art fairs? Maybe. No, not really. Or publications or, Basquiat shows or whatever. No. It's probably good for tourism. I don't know if it's good for art necessarily. That's just my opinion. I don't mean to cause offense. But I guess ultimately it comes down to a city that collectively concludes that it wants to be a part of art more than it doesn't. Collectively, as opposed to just a handful of people buying stuff as an asset class or whatever, really. So it's up to you. In terms of London, we have a different case. The city's old. The empire's long since kaput. It's different. The way that London handles art is in such a way that a work made in 1991 could be regarded in market terms as historic. Unquestionably so, whereas here maybe it's different. I don't know. I'll be very curious to come back in a few years and see how things shake out with you guys, though. Now, my time is sadly at an end this evening. Let me thank you so much for listening to my words, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.